Invisible Experts Podcast.
Hello, everyone. For me, it's a pleasure having Julie Pybus, one of our advisory members. She's a journalist. She's been working as a journalist in the sector for a long time. Hello, Julie. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good. I'm very
Good.
good. Thank you for accepting our invitation in this podcast of Invisible Experts. This is actually our number nine. Um, so how are you? What are you doing now? What do you up to?
What am I up to? I'm up to lots of different things. I've just finished writing a news story about the new social impact investment wholesaler in Canada, which launched yesterday, which Canada's very excited about. So that's going to support social entrepreneurs and other impact people in Canada with finance, which is good news. I'm planning for the conference of the Asian Venture Philanthropy Network, which is coming up at the end of June in Kuala Lumpur. What else? I've been planning some workshops for some young journalists who want to campaign about social and environmental issues. So we're doing a bit of training with some young people across the EU and the UK. I've just edited a little publication to help farmers look at their carbon footprints. Loads of stuff this week.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. So you have a lot going on.
Yeah.
Julie, so how's your story? How Julie starts working in the sustainable sector? How do you maybe perhaps you start to take an interest in this kind of doing good ecosystem, and then you decide to start your journalism focusing on these kind of enterprises, initiatives, and so on.
It was kind of coincidence, really. I think I kind of fell into it. I qualified as a magazine journalist years ago. And then after my training, I moved with some friends to London and we all were looking for jobs in journalism. So you kind of take the first job that comes up. So happily, the first job that came up for me was an editorial assistant at a magazine for charities in the UK. So I took that and it was very badly paid and it was really hard work, but I kind of enjoyed it. And then I moved on to edit Third Sector magazine, which is for charities in the UK as well. And then I was a freelance and I worked for The Guardian and for government departments, writing about regeneration, writing about the third sector. And at that time, the social economy or the social enterprises as a concept were just beginning to bubble up in the UK. And I ended up writing more and more about social entrepreneurs and what would become impact investment.
Very interesting. So, as a journalist, what's the most perhaps interesting experience, or perhaps if you have an anecdote that Julie has, maybe faced or experienced working in the sustainable sector?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. And working in the sustainable sector isn't very glamorous at all. So I'm not sure I've got sort of any great stories about meeting rich and famous people or anything like that. I used to spend a lot of time going to like the worst places in the UK and reporting on regeneration or reporting on sort of the worst estates and that sort of thing. But I think through it all, the most interesting stuff is always the people who are there on the front line making a difference. So there's always sort of interesting little stories in what might be the worst. You think you're going to the worst place, but actually it's so exciting because there's interesting things going on. I had a nice experience once. I was invited by a philanthropic foundation of a pharmaceutical company to go to Sarajevo, and that was shortly after the war, and I found myself on a business class flight, which was made a change. Doesn't ever happen. So but yeah, I saw some amazing stuff in like in the ruins of Sarajevo after the war, they were showing me the health projects they were supporting and training the nurses to deal with the situation after the war there in these sort of concrete buildings which had bullet holes in and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's always the people that are interesting.
Wow. So do you think the sector has changed substantially across the years? I mean, like, did you see any substantial change since we started and now how perhaps the ecosystem evolved?
Yeah, what's interesting, I suppose the language has changed a lot. So now we talk a lot about social entrepreneurs or impact enterprises or that sort of thing. But I always say, in the UK, for example, if you go back to the 60s, that generation were change makers. They were out there demonstrating. They were forming what we might call now social enterprises. The cooperative movement has been going for decades, and across the world, those cooperative similar organizations have existed in different formats in so many different places. So I think a lot of the actions have always been there in different ways, but perhaps we're calling it different things now.
Yeah, I suppose in terms of the technicality and maybe these kind of buzzwords that they just emerged from the sector that have been always existed, isn't it? It's becoming more popular and so on. So do you think the future is promising for our sector? Do you think perhaps throughout the years we've been doing quite well in order to maybe storytelling what's going on in the world in terms of the impact that some organizations and individuals made onto society and so on? Do you think there is a gleam of hope, you know, perhaps invested by these people who work in our sector?
Yeah, I think it's different in different countries. So for the UK, I think it's quite easy to feel a bit dispirited because 15 years ago, the government was all about supporting social enterprise, supporting social investment, getting that going, and the ministers knew what the words meant and were up for it. But now you fight it. You have to sort of tell the same story to the civil servants, to the ministers every time about what the impact sector is trying to do, and it's a bit sort of like, why do we have to do this again? This is so dispiriting. But then if you look at Canada, which I was writing about today, one of the government ministers said when she was launching this new impact fund, which has got 755 million Canadian dollars from the government in it, she said, we want Canada's economy to be a sustainable economy, and you can't have profit without purpose. So different countries are in different situations, I think. And then I was really lucky to go to Sudan a few years ago, just after the revolution in 2019. And there was a whole cohort of young people who were really excited about rebuilding a new Sudan and were forming what we might call social enterprises or creative enterprises, and really impassioned about like starting a new country. And then you look at Sudan now and you wonder where those young people are, and I can't get them on the internet at the moment and that sort of thing. So different countries go through different stages, and I think those glimmers of hope sort of shine and then fade away and then might shine again.
Wow, that's fascinating. I was thinking, I mean, for someone like you who've been traveling, who've been traveling for a long time and visiting different initiatives. I mean, what country, perhaps did you find more interesting in terms of this kind of like sustainable sector that you didn't really expect, because of, whatever stereotype, that you found fascinating?
That I didn't really expect. I don't know. I suppose I've always gone to countries where I've known there was something interesting, but I went to New Zealand for the Social Enterprise World Forum a few years ago, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier. The indigenous speakers on the stage were saying, look, we've done social enterprise for centuries. It's not new to us. This is the way our communities do business. And just sort of taking a different look at different cultures and different interpretations of doing business, doing trade, supporting communities is so interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Like media, right? Media communication is so important for many, many things. Like I'm wondering, because even in your sector, you also contributing, to the production of good information, okay? Transparent, good news, less sensational. So how important is for young journalists to start to get involved in this kind of the sustainable sector from your perspective?
Yeah, it's super important. And at Pioneers Post, we really promote an approach to journalism which is called solutions journalism, which is gaining traction around the world. And that's about not just reporting the bad things that happen in the world, but you acknowledge the bad things that are happening in the world, but look at who's trying to solve the world's problems. And then you bring those stories to the people and say, look, we might have a climate crisis, but in this country, this person has a solution for their community. Or look, we might have a cost of living crisis, but look what these people are doing to try and solve it. And it's interesting because the negative news has been shown to turn people off. People literally turn off, because it's, especially during the pandemic, it was overwhelming for people to have all this negative news coming at them. And then they feel powerless, they feel sort of mental ill health as a result of it. And that sort of traditional tabloid sensationalism can be exciting and interesting, but you need to think about the sort of impacts of how you tell stories on your audiences, but also on the people whose stories you're telling. And sometimes as a journalist, you have to help the people you're interviewing to tell their story and support them, and be kind and nice to people, and get those stories out there in the fairest way you can.
Fantastic. So for you, how important is storytelling, for these type of organizations or initiatives? Because I have the feeling, there is so much to do about it, right? Still, from my perspective, I have the feeling, they're still invisible, right?
Yeah, yes, a lot of them aren't they? And what's really frustrating sometimes is I sit in meetings of impact investors, and they're wringing their hands. They don't know how to get out there and find out what grassroots social entrepreneurs want and need. And you're just saying, well, you just go out the front door of your beautiful office building and talk to some people. Is not that hard, but there is a gulf, isn't there, between people who have their story told very easily, people who control the media, who are always there telling their story, and other people who don't always have the opportunities. A friend of mine runs a social enterprise and she trains people from what some people might call hard to reach communities to tell their stories to the media and to engage with journalists. And I think that's super important, to allow those voices to come through.
Yeah. So, like the other day I was thinking, nowadays, consumers, I think I have the feeling they want simple, information, like very quick information. That's why Reels, kind of like the apps like TikTok
Mhm.
or a little bit of Instagram and YouTube Reels, because they are very simple. But the thing is, you know, explaining these type of initiatives or organizations, it takes time. So I was wondering how challenging for you, from your experience, is to try to simplify and in a way spoon feed this kind of of information to people, right?
Yeah. And one of the bad things about social entrepreneurs for journalists is that social entrepreneurs are so embedded in what they're doing. If you ask them what they're doing, they'll take 20 minutes explaining it to you, because it is, when they're there every day, it is complicated, and there
It
are
is.
nuances and subtleties that are important to learn to understand. But actually, I work with social entrepreneurs sometimes on their elevator pitch, being able to tell their story in just a few sentences, and then once you've got over that hurdle of sort of getting the essence across of what you're doing, then you can go into the details, and once you've captured someone, you can then sort of explain it in more granular detail. But I totally understand where the social entrepreneurs are coming from, because it is complicated. And
Yeah, it is. I mean, like, as you said before, solving the most pressure societal issues is not an easy task, isn't it? So you
mhm,
have to take time to explain how
mhm,
to do it, because sometimes they have developed these kind of complex business models in order
mhm.
to sustain themselves. So it's not rather simple, right? So of course you tell a lot of stories, you write a lot of stories. Do you have perhaps a favorite story, and why?
A favorite story? I don't know. I like telling the stories, like I said before, of the people, of the social entrepreneurs. So, and I write so many stories, they go past me like every day. I'm like another story out the door. But there's a lovely story I wrote the other day about a social enterprise in the UK called the Sewing Rooms. And that is a social enterprise that trains women who may have experienced domestic violence or some difficulty, challenge in their life, to sew, to become use sewing machines and make things. And then the Sewing Rooms has won contracts. This is the beautiful thing about social enterprise, where it's working really well. So it's doing that social thing, but it's also a really good business, because it's won contracts with like hotel chains to make things for the chains. And the most recent thing I wrote, which is lovely, it's got a sense of humour as well. They made dressing gowns to celebrate the king's coronation, and they were all like purple dressing gowns with sort of furry collars, and you could sort of sit at home if you buy one of these celebratory dressing gowns and watch the coronation in your purple robe. And it's kind of like great business decision, because it's with a massive hotel chain, this
Yeah,
contract. It's a little bit fun, and it's also doing social good. So what's not to like about that?
yeah, yeah. Of course, of course. News in relation to sustainability are getting more attention, right?
Mm.
However, I have the feeling that yet readers and viewers aren't consuming sustainable news. Why do you think there isn't yet a big interest in the sustainable sector from the readers or viewers?
Well, I think it's partly about how the stories are told.
Okay.
Um, but like I said before, there is, I think there is a growing desire among audiences to move away from negative news that doesn't empower people, to find stories that are not not uplifting, fluffy stuff, but are empowering and can sort of help people to look at the world in a different way. So obviously, Pioneers Post does it, but talking about more consumer oriented things, there's a publication, online thing called Reasons to be Cheerful, which does, like you're saying, Instagram reels and little Instagram posts about the sort of things we've been talking about impact enterprises or about social entrepreneurs, and showing you positive things that are happening in the face of crises, in the face of social dysfunction or environmental problems. So I think there's more and more happening, and there's the big national news organisations are looking at this approach. This approach too. The BBC does it, the Guardian does it, New York Times does it. So I think I hope there's a growing movement. I think there's a growing movement.
Yeah, I hope so too. So we're gonna talk about Pioneers Post because you just mentioned that. So what's the story of the Pioneers Post?
Okay,
When it
so
started and how does it
yeah,
work?
it's it was started by the founding editor, who's Tim West. We've been going for about 2 decades in one form or another. And it grew out, Pioneers Post grew out of Social Enterprise magazine, which was a traditional magazine focused on the UK for social entrepreneurs and impact investors. And we gradually sort of widened our viewpoint to be less solely UK focused, to be more global focused. And it kind of tied quite nicely with the UK government when we were just beginning. It was when the UK government was really supporting social enterprise and impact investment, and we used to easily get interviews with government ministers who knew what they were talking about with social enterprise and impact investment. And then the sort of movement has grown around the world, and we as Pioneers Post have grown with it. So you can find it at pioneerspost.com. I better get that in.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting.
Mm.
So how people, or individuals can connect with Pioneers Post and subscribe, or how does it work?
It's you can look at the website, which is pioneerspost.com, and you see a lot of free stuff on there. We put things behind a paywall after about a month, but some things are totally free to view anyway. Yeah, our business model is we rely on subscriptions. So we very much value the people who pay for a subscription, and we also work in partnership with organisations like the British Council and others like that. It's tough to be a media organisation. We're a social enterprise as well. It's tough to be a media organisation in this particular economy. So yeah, we're always frustrated that there's so much stuff out there that we don't have time or resources to cover. So we're looking for investment to grow as well. So yeah, we've got massive ambitions, but yeah, waiting to fulfill them at the minute.
Yeah, of course. So from your perspective, what's the biggest impact of Pioneers Post?
The biggest impact, that's interesting. We're looking at impact and measuring it in all sorts of ways at the minute. So it's all kind of, we could count how many stories we publish or that sort of thing. But more interestingly is the kind of qualitative stuff where you can say somebody's taken an action as a result of something you've written, or you've inspired someone to look at something a different way. But we're not just about writing articles or publishing podcasts or that sort of thing. We also run training for people. So we did a program for young journalists around the world a few years ago, 2019 to 2020. And several of those young people who we introduced to the impact world and writing about the impact world are still working within the impact ecosystem. And they trace that directly back to the training that they had with us, introducing them to solutions journalism and introducing them to the impact ecosystem. So that sort of thing is really powerful.
Yeah, of course. So this is interesting because you mentioned several times impact investment.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how you guys can get, perhaps to have an impact investment to your Pioneers Post, or do you think impact investing are looking for another type of organizations, or What do you
Yeah,
think?
it's something that we're looking at. So it's practicing what we preach. Yeah, we're looking at it.
Yeah, because I suppose having known all this information, having had, having had all these contacts, I think the natural way would be like knock the door to impact investment and see how it works.
Yeah.
So do you think? Yeah, please.
I think it's that thing, where you ask a designer if they've got a logo, and they're like, "No, I haven't done myself a logo. I've just done everyone else a logo." It's that sort of, you've
Yeah,
got to practice what you preach, don't you, and sort of find the time to do that sort of thing.
exactly. Where, like, what do you think are the impact investors are looking for? What do you think? What's the profile? What type of organizations?
Oh, I don't know. Different impact investors are looking for different things, aren't they? And as we know in the UK, the impact investing movement has been, it says, very successful. But then the Adabawali Commission last year, I think it was, or was it the year before, came out and said very strongly that impact investment in the UK isn't getting to the diverse communities, isn't getting as far down to the grassroots as it should. And that was a pretty damning indictment of the impact sector in the UK, which has been so celebrated, and it needs to change. So what they're looking for might not be what's actually needed.
Wow, that's very interesting. So do you think perhaps they were looking for maybe other type of, the profile have to be a bit more scalable, or perhaps because usually grassroots organizations, they struggle, right? I mean, they are usually the ones who need investment and, social capital and financial capital and perhaps seed capital in order to sustain themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, so those grassroots organisations need extra support, don't they? They need more patient capital. They need a flexible investor who actually understands their day-to-day business and the economic environment that they're operating in, and maybe the personal circumstances in
Yeah.
which they're operating, as well as maybe a single mother, or somebody living in a really difficult community. So you need those impact investors to understand really fully the people who need their support. And sometimes the impact investors say they can't, in their defense, they say they can't support those kind of people because they're not the right people to do it. They might just need a grant from a philanthropist to get them to the next step.
Yeah, this is I was thinking like, I mean, it became better, but I think perhaps there is a little, lack of professionalization in the sector, don't you think? Do you think in your experience? Because of course, if you want to go and knock the door to an impact investor, you have to have the jargon, you have to have your numbers correct, right? You need to know how to talk to these people. Usually, like at the grassroots level, they're very passionate and they have this kind of hint of activism and so on. So, do you think perhaps they have to be more professional in that sense, or perhaps to maybe join this kind of like professional courses and so on? Or
Firstly, I think the impact investors need to talk their language
yeah,
better. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There does need to be, I don't want to call it professionalization because I don't want to knock the passion and the activism
yeah,
out, but upskilling people to be able to get those few steps further is important. Yeah, but they've got to maintain their commitment and their reason for being, their reason for doing that in the end. But yeah, if you want to be a social entrepreneur, you have to be businesslike and you have to make tough decisions, and you can't say, oh, I'm going to carry on paying that person because I like them,
yeah,
or you've got to make those tough decisions sometimes and give yourself the skills to operate in a business-like way.
It's true because, in my experience, the impact investment sector or the impact investors, they tend to be fancy, like with fancy suits and,
Yeah.
people from the city, right?
Mhm.
Like distributing and, managing this money towards these people. So I have the feeling that sometimes they speak different languages and they are really not accessible, aren't they? Because I don't know, they looking, that's why perhaps, as you mentioned before, they failed to talk to to the grassroots people because at the end of the day, they speak in another language, right?
Yeah, and they've been recruited from the banking sector, or they're sort of in their towers and not knowing what real life is sometimes. So yeah, it needs to change. It needs to change.
Yeah, yeah. I want to talk about your drivers, Julie. I was wondering why you are so committed in this cause, because when I reflect on the sustainable ecosystem, I always think, what are the drivers of people like you, and why do you start with these, and whether or not it's worthy?
Um, yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Sometimes when I'm delving into a financial report and trying to explain in a story how social investment works or what a really difficult fund is, I think, oh my God, I wish I was writing about lipstick or something. Why didn't I do that? But that wouldn't be so interesting, would it? I think
Yeah,
this is interesting. It's challenging, yeah. And as I've said a few times, I think the people, the social entrepreneurs, the impact entrepreneurs, the people who want to make a difference are the drivers. I can't do it myself, but I tell their stories instead.
yeah, of course, of course. In terms of challenges, based on your experience writing stories, what are the challenges that sustainable entrepreneurs or sustainable companies face the most?
Finances, of course. It's always
Yeah,
finances, isn't it? Cash
yeah,
flow. Yeah, cash flow specifically is tough, isn't it? When they've got a grant or a pot of money that only lasts a year, and then you've got to go out and seek another pot of funding to keep you going for the next 12 months. That's so tough because people are always running to stand still and trying to chase the funding they need just to survive. So that's just the story that always comes up. But also we see burnout a lot among these change makers, because they're sort of, a lot of them don't pay themselves very much, and they've got families and they're trying to run a business that they really believe in, and you're just setting yourself up for burnout there if
yeah.
you don't take care. So we see kind of quite a lot of that, too much of that. Yeah, yeah.
I know. I suppose for them, it's really hard not to give up at some point, right? Because if you cannot pay your bills and perhaps you just at the end of the month you cannot pay your staff, it is a challenge, right? I mean, I have the feeling it always comes to the financial aspect, right?
Yeah, and that also leads to a problem, a sort of structural problem, in that sometimes the only people who can afford to be social entrepreneurs are rich people who've got their own money somewhere.
Yeah,
So that's that's a structural problem that doesn't make change happen where it needs to happen all the time. So yeah, that's an issue.
I know. Especially like, maybe when the welfare state isn't, good enough managing all this money, and in a way they don't trust, these type of organizations to ensure, delivering social and
Hmm.
environmental value, right?
Well, the social value government commissioning debate is a big one, isn't it? And sort of all
Yeah.
these organizations having to jump through hoops, tiny organizations jump through big hoops to get small contracts from local authorities and governments and that sort of thing. So that's something that needs to change.
So do you think, because this is perhaps is my impression, but do you think the UK, in terms of our sector, um, structurally speaking, is more developed than other countries in the world? I mean, probably Canada is quite strong, right? Because of the code movement.
Mm. The UK more strong? I don't think so. I think Scotland would probably put itself out there and say it's at the forefront, while England is lagging behind now. And Wales has been doing some good stuff recently. But yeah, the cooperatives movement is amazingly well developed in places like India, isn't it?
Yeah,
So
I know, right?
it's easy for the UK to sort of say, oh, we're really good at social investment and social entrepreneurship. But if you look at the diversity of the impact ecosystem, it's amazingly developed all around the world in different ways.
I know, I know. I think that's the case of Latin America, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
that they have a long tradition with co-ops and associations or
Yeah.
foundations and so on. And there is a very interesting mix with the indigenous culture because as you mentioned before, New Zealand, Canada, Australia too,
Mm-hmm.
India or maybe Sudan, how the natives are have been practicing this kind of initiative for years and centuries, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And it needs recognizing. And then in Europe, the conversation recently has been about how developed France and Spain are in terms of the social, what they call the social economy
Yeah.
in Europe. And yet, I don't know, you might know as well how difficult it is to start a small business in Spain and all the bureaucracy and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's
So
crazy.
there's,
It's
there's
impossible.
crazy things
It's really hard.
in different places, isn't there?
I know, I know, I know. And it's very tough because especially you have to pay a lot of taxes
Yeah.
way ahead of actually start to move your enterprise
Hmm.
ahead, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
sometimes I'm wondering whether they do it on purpose. They don't want they don't want people you know, to develop their entrepreneurial skills because it's really hard,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. And then you face all the paperwork and the bureaucracy and the local authority town hall stuff, and it's too
Yeah.
much, isn't it?
And when that happens, you get discouraged, right? And that's why I think you mentioned this before, like law is so important because as easy it is, as more accessible and simple as people get into the sector, more naturally, right? So do you
Hmm.
think
Hmm.
sustainable enterprises are the way forward?
Yeah, I hope they have to be. I think they have to be. What's interesting, picking up on what we were just talking about then and the bureaucracy, is that there was a really interesting conversation at the Social Enterprise World Forum Policy Forum last week, and it was acknowledging how much how much social entrepreneurship in Africa takes place in the informal economy. So
Mm,
people running little businesses that aren't properly registered, but there's a social economy strategy for Africa now, which recognises and acknowledges the importance of the informal economy and how the impact investors or whoever's supporting need to go out and recognize right down to those informal economy actors, and support them. So yeah, if we look at the informal economy, if we look at micro enterprises all around the world, there's so many exciting things going on as long as they're not quashed by bureaucracy. Yeah, hopefully they are the future of
yeah,
business, of the economy.
yeah, yeah. I think it's very interesting what you just mentioned because, like, then again, I think the whole Latin American context is a case by itself, right? Because, basically in Ecuador, Colombia, Chile,
Hmm.
Argentina, it's clear the popular economy and the social economy, or social and solidarity economy.
Yeah.
And at some point they mixed,
Yeah.
they work together in the same world, right? Because informality is it's one of the key aspects of this kind of context, right? I
Mm.
was working with this kind of like, it's a kind of a credit union, and we had a bunch of organizations, and honestly, they manage a lot of money, right?
Hmm.
And I was surprised how they managed a lot of money and the impact is so little. I don't know. I was kind of shocked, because I don't know. Maybe they have 30 cases, but they have a budget of $1.5 million. I'm like,
Hmm.
what?
Hmm.
This is crazy, right?
So where's the money going?
No, I don't know. It just, maybe they are too ambitious. And I was talking to them. It's just because they have very little cases, because they try to resolve all the social issues in one case,
Yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
Like
Uh-huh.
education,
Hmm.
healthcare, shelter, food, and so on. So, that costs a lot of money, right?
Yeah. 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 It costs money to solve social problems. So yeah,
I
we know
know,
that.
I know, I know, I know. It's very interesting. Um, Okay, I have like another question for you, because of course you have been writing a lot of stories about different initiatives. So, what tips for people who want to start to work or perhaps create new initiatives for the social or environmental or sustainable impact sector would you say to them, or would you recommend?
I say learn from what's gone before. So that links back to what we were talking about skills, doesn't it? So even if you're starting a new enterprise or a new idea, you don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. You can look and see what's been done before and learn from other people and do some training or read Pioneer's post about the things you're trying to do, or network a bit, talk to other people and try and find out what's failed before and what's succeeded before, and try and learn from that. It's it's sort of really frustrating sometimes. We talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, well I'm doing this, and we're like, well, we wrote a story about that, that's not going to work. So there's a load of knowledge out there already, so you don't have to start completely from scratch all the time.
Yeah. Communication is really important nowadays, because of course nowadays we have more access to the social media and different blogs. It's more accessible for everyone, really. So for you, what are the top three communication strategies for companies in the sustainable sector?
Top three sustainable companies communication strategies. Okay, I think number one's be honest.
Hmm.
So if something goes wrong, don't try and sort of cover it up and pretend it hasn't happened, because someone will find out. You've just got to be honest and own your mistakes and learn from them. And as a journalist, it's so much better to talk to people who are being honest than people who are trying to cover something up. And as a journalist, I can work with somebody and say, thank you for being honest with me. Let's try and see how we can put that in a story and make it work for you and for me. And we can work on it together instead of it having to be an antagonistic relationship. So I think that sort of honesty and clarity is really important. What else? I think sometimes people rely too much on a sort of heropreneur story, like this person is going to change the world. And actually putting all the storytelling around one person and making them a hero isn't necessarily the best way, because then everything sort of fails with that person if if they fail. So maybe look at your organization and tell the story of your organization, tell the story of the person you've got at the front line answering the phones or something like that, not just the one person who says, oh, I'm the big boss, I'm the big character, but sort of look a bit more widely at sort of the story you're telling about your organization. One more. Oh, I know, send photos to journalists, because I get all this stuff coming through, and every story I write has to have a photo at the top of it, and then I get great stories, I can write the story, but then I've got to find a photo, which takes me another half hour to find, or several phone calls, or and like I don't have that time, and I'm really frustrated trying to find a beautiful photo. And these organizations you've got a phone, you can take an amazing photo of somebody you're supporting, or your team in action, or the environment in which you're working, or that sort of thing. It's easy to take photos now. So yeah, photos, please.
Fantastic. Thank you. The last question is, what are the best sources to read news about the sustainability sector, social enterprise sector, etc.?
Well, I've got to say Pioneers Post, don't I?
Of course, of course.
Yeah, so look at Pioneers Post. That would be really good. I mentioned Reasons to be Cheerful earlier. They're really good to look at. Look at them on Instagram or something like that before, because they're sort of telling stories of sustainability stories in a bit more of a generalist way for a wider audience. So they're really nice to look at, and a lot of visual-led stories, which are really great. I think your local Facebook group, your local community, if you had a local paper anymore, your local paper, because it's the people out there in your communities making the difference that are the people doing this sustainability stuff. And those stories are all around us in our communities. They're our neighbours, it's not some sort of distant thing. It's sort of all of us and how we work together.
Fantastic. So, Julie, I want to thank you for giving up your time. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Oh, it's been fun. Thanks.
I'm pretty sure our viewers are going to enjoy that, and they will learn a lot from your experience. Thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you for your time as well. It's not often I'm interviewed, so it makes a bit of a change.
I know, right? It's usually the opposite, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm not used to doing so much talking. So yeah, that was fun. Thank you.
Fantastic, Julie. Thank you so much.